Hi, my name is Chaumtoli Huq. I'm the editor of Law at the Margins. Law at the Margins is a social media platform that was launched to amplify voices and perspectives that often aren't heard in mainstream discourse or media. And it's to highlight and bring to each of you what's happening on the ground. You can check out great articles by lawyers, activists at lawatthemargins.com, and you can actually subscribe and learn about future programming in terms of writing as well as Google Chats. This Google Chat, Twitter, and Facebook chats are ways in which we can bring on-the-ground activists who are on the front line and bring them together in reflective discussions. Today, we're going to talk about the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement that is being used to uplift and bring up the voices of Palestinians. And to help us in this discussion, we have great guests. We have 4 guests with us. We have Lamis J Deek, who's a human rights lawyer. We have Anuja Bose, who is a union member and graduate student organizer at UCLA. We have Chertoff, who is an organizer with Jewish Voices for Peace. And last but not least, we have Liz Jackson, who is an attorney as well with the Palestinian Legal Support. So the way we're going to have this discussion is we're going to have each of our guests sort of lead us off to give us some context. On the right-hand side, for those of you who are participating, welcome. There's a Q&A function. So while you're listening to the guests, please, I encourage you to ask questions because we want this to be a discussion format. I also want to thank Albert, who you're not going to see, who's our social media consultant, in terms of really bringing this chats to you. So let's begin our discussion. I want to begin with Lamis. As a longtime Palestinian American activist and human rights lawyer, can you share with our guests what is the BDS movement, what's its origins, and help us place it in context of the larger struggle for Palestinian justice?
Thank you, Chaumtoli, for having me tonight and for organizing this great discussion. I'm not going to go too deep into the history of the BNC. That's all readily available, and I'll provide the link shortly. But the first call for boycott came from the PNC in 2004, which was a call for the cultural and academic boycott. Shortly after the decision against the wall, then we saw that a larger group had come together to call for a more comprehensive, more inclusive, broader boycott, divestment, and sanction action across the world. And that was its initiation. And this was supported then in 2006 by the vast majority of representatives and organizations of civil society in Palestine and throughout Palestine as it's defined by Palestinians. And at the heart of this was this request that people essentially withdraw their support, this maybe unthoughtful sort of support for the Israeli expansionist institutions and entity. And it was calling for an end of asking people to support the Palestinian call for the end of the occupation and colonization of Palestine and the recognition of Palestinian rights in the 48 territories, and requesting the world to support, promote, and recognize the right of Palestinian refugees to return to their original homes and lands. And that was its initiation. And the first action that I know of that happened in the US was one that we were involved with in 2005, and that was the divestment conference that was held first at Rutgers University, and it was quite controversial, and I'll talk about that later. But I'd like to focus a bit on, like you said, positioning it in the context. BDS as a movement has been very critical, especially as a vehicle to advance the discourse on Palestine. It's been a vehicle to expand the creative, the imagination, to fill in the gaps of the imagination of what Palestinian solidarity looks like. So it's been a really effective tool. But I think it's important to understand that it is but one singular tool in the context of Palestinian resistance, and it is in fact the absolute least that we can do, because it's not requesting an affirmative action. What the BDS call and movement asks people to do is to stop supporting and empowering the structures and the institutions that are directly and in less direct ways responsible for the subjugation, the oppression, the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. And I think that that's very important to keep in mind. The other thing I would like to say is that it does operate and talk a lot about and operate within the apartheid framework and the international law framework. And those are very important frameworks, but they're also limiting frameworks. What we see in Palestine is not necessarily a fair analogy to the South African situation. Whereas there was more subjugation in South Africa, what we are seeing is an ethnic cleansing. And now we have the normalization of the word genocide, which is in fact what has been happening in various stages. So we have a fairly different situation in Palestine, and there are limitations to what we know to be international law, because international law effectively comes and depends on the actual actions, the de facto situation, the power dynamics, and it responds to that. And so I would say those are two places of caution, but it has made incredible improvement by leaps and bounds by creating space for Palestinians, for Palestinian solidarity, for the Palestinian narrative in a way that we really have not seen previously. And this is something that has been tremendously helpful for the Palestinians in the US, who are targeted in a myriad of ways on and off campus and in our communities in a way that is really nightmarish, and also for our people in Palestine and in the refugee camps. I don't want to go on too long, Chaumtoli, so I'll leave it here and I'll input wherever else you'd like me to input.
Thank you. I know it was an unfair question to ask you to give such a broad and rich, textured history of resistance, but I think it's important to mention that we're focused on one particular tactic, and I think part of the reason was so that those who are listening and those who are interested in getting involved could, at least in the United States, get involved and know how to do the organizing work. So I want to shift now to Rick and ask Rick, Jewish Voices for Peace and yourself as a Jewish identified organizer, why has it been important for you personally and JPP to be invested and involved in the BDS movement?
Well, thank you for having me as part of this discussion, and I just want to say at the beginning that I'm just blown away by the degree that Lamis is so articulate on this issue. I'm so happy about that. To your question, I usually introduce myself at meetings these days as I say, my name is Rick Chertoff, I'm a recovering Zionist, and that's why I have to keep going to meetings. And that's because, like most Jews in this country or in Israel or anywhere, we were brought up and really indoctrinated with a certain narrative. Lamis mentioned the Palestinian narrative. We didn't know who a Palestinian was. We didn't know they existed. And beyond that, what we were taught of when push came to shove was essentially a version of the frontier narrative. You know, there are these savages out there, and they must be suppressed before they kill us all. I mean, everybody's familiar with that. Hang on a second. And so that personally is, you know, finding out through one way and another, including traveling in Israel and Palestine, finding out that in fact there is an oppressive system going on in our name with our tax dollars is very motivating once we broke through and found that out. And we want to tell that to our fellow Jews and fellow Americans. And that we don't have to be in opposition to an indigenous people. We can be in harmony with them. But that can't happen under the current system. The current system needs to be changed. And we're not going to be able to do that with, you know, in Los Angeles with machine guns or bombs or anything of a violent nature, obviously. But what we can do is get into the consciousness of the American people who, regardless of the behavior of the status quo in the United States, legally, governmentally, or anything else, probably, if you ask them, they really believe in equality. Israel doesn't. And, you know, they might make some tepid attempt to, but that's why Jewish Voice for Peace exists, is to project our interpretation of what it means to be a Jew, what we feel our parents and grandparents and all the way back stood for, not being, you know, an oppressive apartheid regime. So that's really the motivation for us, is to live the way we see Judaism, which is the same way that other people see their religions for the most part, which is developing a win-win with other people, communicating on an equitable basis, and seeing to it that, as it says in the Talmud, justice, justice thou shalt pursue. So if you don't do that, the rest of the religious stuff about, you know, when you eat, what you eat, and all that sort of thing really falls away, because it comes down to how will you treat your fellow human being, and that's what we're about. So I hope that at least gives you a beginning of, you know, why we're motivated.
Great, no, thank you. And at this point, again, I want to encourage guests who are listening into the discussion to use the Q&A function, which is on the left hand of your screen. And if you pose those questions, I'll pose them to the guests. I want to move now. We've talked about sort of why Jewish Voices for Peace have been involved as a sort of faith-based constituency. I want to move to Anuja to talk about, as a graduate student union organizer, your union has supported the BDS movement, to talk about why labor involvement is key and how the work you've been doing sort of at the academic campus level has been pretty successful, at least as of late, and what's been the shift in the at least the favorability of the public opinion on some of those campaigns.
Sure, thanks for having me, Chaumtoli. Yeah, I mean, we have had tremendous success. So the vote that we won on December 4th, we won by 65%. 65% of the graduate student member body voted for BDS. And so, I mean, I guess at a most basic level, the labor movement is a powerful location to build solidarity for wider political struggles advocating for human rights. And I think that, you know, the UAW 2865, like, it's really built on a model of social justice unionism. And so in some ways there was a kind of like natural kind of growth in building solidarity with BDS. And I kind of want to build on Lamis's point. So you know, unions are a part of civil society, and so this is a location from which to really change the discourse and narrative around Palestinian rights and self-determination. So for the most part, the national political discourse has been kind of hijacked and is not really going anywhere. But people are not just affiliated with political parties, they're also members of unions and religious organizations and charity foundations and professional academic organizations and so on. So insofar as unions are a part of this sort of kind of ecosystem of civil society, they have an important opportunity to change the dialogue and kind of recenter issues of human rights violations, and also examine the complicity of their state, organization, and community in perpetuating these violations. So in many ways, that's sort of what I see our vote as having done at the University of California campuses. So while the ballot and the outcome of the vote was overwhelmingly positive and in favor of BDS, it was really kind of the process of getting graduate student workers to engage with the issue that was so vital. And I guess the other thing I want to emphasize is the importance of the action that rank-and-file members at the International Longshore Worker Union took in Oakland last August in 2014 when they successfully blocked Israeli ships from unloading goods. And they did this in solidarity with actually a diverse group of social justice activists under the banner of Block the Boat Coalition. So what's important about this is that, you know, taking away our labor, and in this case refusing to work by unloading goods, is an important labor tactic. That's what we do when we go on strike. And it's actually quite central that we use this tactic to support the boycott aspect of BDS. So in our case, in our union, the UAW 2865, we represent graduate student workers, so the academic boycott is a key part of that ballot, which meant that we were forced to think about what we as academic workers, where we will and will not expend our labor, essentially. So those two elements of civil society, but also just the kind of tactics that labor unions have before them, I think that's kind of what makes labor so central to this movement.
Let me just ask a follow-up question in terms of, which may not be known to folks who are new to the BDS. What is the distinction between boycott, divestment, and sanctions? Lamis talked about the movement beginning primarily as a cultural and an academic boycott. Can you just explain to us sort of what are the differences in each of these sort of strategies that are involved? Who's the audience that you're speaking to in the B and the D and the yes, Anuja.
Sure. So, I mean, generally speaking, you know, boycotts are things that you can take kind of at an individual level, whether or not, you know, you choose to purchase goods that have been sort of made in the occupied territories, or that kind of thing. And divestment is basically kind of at either at the sort of institutional level of kind of divesting from corporations, but also also kind of organizations that are complicit with the occupation, but also like universities, you know, within Israel who have who engage in discriminatory policies towards Palestinian students, and then obviously sanctions are at the state level, and so a part of our definitely a part of the ballot was that we were asking that we were asking the U.S. to end military aid, but also the University of California and then the UAW International to divest from companies that were complicit, but in human rights violations. So those are sort of like three ways to distinguish it.
Great. I want to now bring in Liz Jackson from Palestinian Legal Support Center. With all the organizing that's been happening in the United States, I know that your center began to really provide support to activists. Can you share with us what kind of support or what kind of requests for support are you seeing? Why don't we begin with that?
Sure, and I'm also really grateful to be part of this conversation. So thank you for organizing it, Chaumtoli. So my organization, Palestine Solidarity Legal Support, it's a mouthful, and we formed specifically to address the problem of legal bullying, or lawfare is a term some people use, to intimidate, suppress, and often punish Palestine solidarity activists in the U.S. The problem is quite severe. You know, we've had over, I think it was 235 requests for legal support just in 2014. So the kinds of requests that we're getting are from, and a large majority of these are from people who are organizing boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaigns. Some are other community activists working on other forms of activism, but because the BDS movement is you know, catching fire and so prominent among activists in the U.S., the majority of requests for legal support have something to do with the BDS campaign. So what we're looking at is, first and foremost, the accusation that BDS, or Palestine activism generally, is anti-Semitic. That, you know, support for Palestinian freedom or Palestinian rights is inherently based on, you know, hatred towards Jewish people because of their Jewishness. Although it's not often articulated in that way, it's usually sort of a blanket smear of this is anti-Semitic. So, you know, the major campaigns and major victories have all seen serious accusations of anti-Semitism, which come along with legal threats that these boycott or divestment resolutions violate anti-discrimination laws. So, for example, Anuja's organization, UAW, the Graduate Student Union in California, was accused of violating the California anti-discrimination law, accusing them of the boycott being based on national origin discrimination, and which would be, you know, arguing that would be unlawful. These threats are baseless because in reality these campaigns are not based on national origin. They're based on political ideology and complicity with violation of Palestinian human rights. And they don't. And the academic boycott specifically does not target individuals anyway. It targets institutions. But the main and most important point is that the boycott is based on political ideology and direct complicity with violations of human rights. And the First Amendment, Supreme Court has been very clear that the First Amendment protects boycott as a time-honored American civil rights tradition, and it's protected speech. Anyway, these sort of threats of illegality are very serious, and they smear activists and they can intimidate people, but the threats are baseless. And so the other kind of really important, there's a whole, I can go into more detail about the different kinds of legal threats that are used to intimidate activists, and Lamis can chime in. But the one thing that I'll sort of leave that for questions if people are more are curious about more detail there. But the other piece that I think is really serious is just the extent of harassment and smear campaigns. Activists are, and the tactic is basically to scare and tire people out. Yeah. So activists who put their neck out there, who are vocal about their support for Palestinian liberation and rights are often publicly smeared as anti-Semitic and intimidated. And there's a whole, when you're using the law to intimidate and threaten, there's always a whole host of kinds of legal actions that you can threaten. And usually a whole array of actions are threatened against activists. So so what we're doing is supporting people with kind of what is the law, what is a serious threat, what isn't, and evaluating any threat. And sometimes offering representation and support in the thorough.
Great. Liz, I know that the Palestinian Solidarity Support Center has some great resources and online, and I posted that on the event page, so if folks want to really check out their website, it really has a ton of information. I want to actually turn to Lamis and ask, are you seeing this on the ground in terms of the pushback that Liz mentioned, retaliation? Yes. And so what specifically are you seeing as an activist? And then share one, what are some hopes, some successful campaigns so that, we can also hear about that as well?
It's really hard to say what we're seeing or put it in the context of just, what's been happening lately. The biggest obstacles to the Palestinian movement in generally, which has always included the ideas of withdrawing consent or complicity with Zionist institutions, is the wholesale policing and disciplining of Palestinians and Palestinian activists, and not just by private organizations or Zionist or Israeli organizations, but including the Mossad, Israeli government agents, and government agents, U.S. and local government agents. I think that is the overarching picture. And this extends, I'm not going to talk too much about it in the community, but it is a wholesale attack, and it's a very minutely controlled, very nuanced sort of control and discipline of the Palestinian community. Just to give you one outrageous example, is May 15th, as many know, marks the commemoration of the Nakba, right? And so the Attorney General's office had decided to stage this absolutely ludicrous, unheard of mass arrest of a bunch of Palestinian male elders on that date, and they organized this press conference claiming that these men were supporting terrorists in Palestine and Hezbollah, right? And none of them were charged with any of this. They were shackled hand and feet, paraded across New York and across the courtrooms. Every single one of them was Palestinian. There was not a single terror charge. The only thing this case was about cigarettes being purchased outside of New York and being brought into New York. And this operation, which included people from all backgrounds, nobody was arrested or targeted except for the Palestinians on May 15th, 2013. That is the extent to which the government in New York, and I'm sure in many other areas, is going to let Palestinians know that they were being policed. And a lot of these people were active in BDS movements, in many other movements in the U.S. and in Palestine. So it is the fear of backlash and the backlash itself that is our biggest challenge. A lot of the young people on campus deal with infiltration and the fear of infiltration. They've been infiltrated on and off campuses. This is another huge obstacle. Nonetheless, they continue, and I think that that's what's really optimistic and hopeful, and I'm certainly very hopeful. I've lived long enough to see the tremendous strides that we've made as a community and as a struggle. When I first came to the U.S., my teacher whited out. She literally, lied on my report card, changed my report card because I said I was Palestinian. We couldn't say the word Palestinian up until the 90s. And now here we are. We used to fight for one state solution. Now here we are. There is no other conversation but right to return and one state. And this is tremendous, and it happened in a very short period of time. And what I want people to remember in this is that, number one, that we keep the Palestinians themselves a very central part of it, because throughout, whether it's the campuses or on the streets, it's the Palestinians who are bearing the brunt of the lawfare, both criminal and civil, and all of these other resources that are being used to really quash and slow down and deplete the resources of the movement. And number two, to remember that the strides that the BDS movement has made has come at the sacrifices, suffering, and the resistance of the Palestinians in Palestine and in the camps. And we've seen with each progressive massacre and with the increasing resistance of Palestinians in Palestine, the stronger global movement and support of BDS. And I think those are all reasons to be hopeful that as the situation does deteriorate in Palestine, and as we face more challenges in the US and globally, there is much to be hopeful about. The movement is growing. People are recognizing Palestine. They're recognizing the issue for what it is. And so absolutely, there's tons of hope to be had, Chaumtoli.
You really raised the point that I want to amplify, which is that as we do this movement work or organizing to keep in focus Palestinians who are most infected here in the United States, but also in wherever they are globally, that they're going to feel the full brunt of the backlash. And I think to kind of center ourselves back to why we're doing that is very critical. And also, you mentioned that as the movement gets stronger, and also in the United States, you see the public perception of BDS movement has gotten much more favorable. You see the backlash getting stronger. So I want to ask, Rick, in terms of organizing, I know that you and your organization have probably gotten the anti-Semitic, slur. How have you been responding to this backlash? What are some lessons from organizing that we can take forward?
Well, I mean, Jews, there's a very interesting book published by an American, a Los Angeles, UCLA anthropologist who's now retired, Karen Brodkin, called How Jews Became White Folk, and what that says about America. So, we typically come from a pretty privileged class. We're not the 1%. Most of us aren't. When it comes up, Jews are controlling the world, I ask people why I can't retire sooner. But we do get some of that. I myself was an employee in an executive position in a Jewish Federation organization, matter of fact, Jewish Labor Committee. And when I just brought up the issue of occupation, I'm going back about 15 years, when I brought up occupation, I was summarily fired. That gives you an idea. But I guess the point is that we see the repression of Palestinians both here and in Palestine. It's pretty, I think the consensus would be that the cat's out of the bag. That is to say, the information about who's really David and who's really Goliath is all over the place. And there are wonderful websites you can visit, like Mondo Weiss, typically is, you know, a large Jewish participation, American Jewish participation. You know, there's electronic intifada and so forth. So what I'm saying is that the facts are so heavily on our side that I'm not going to complain about when somebody says that, you know, I'm anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic. At this point, I really say, is that really all you can come up with? I mean, that's really an admission you don't have an argument. And I think that's true for any kind of name calling, you know, so I don't even get excited about it anymore. I just say, look, you know, here are the facts I'm presenting. If you have different ones, and particularly if you have one that absolutely in any way strays from the Israel Zionist playbook, that is to say, Jews are the victims, they're surrounded by, you know, hordes of these savage Arabs who are all terrorists. I mean, that just doesn't cut it anymore amongst thinking people, half-thinking people. So I think that there is a shift that's happened, and I think Lamis pointed to it, that there is a momentum that BDS has given this whole thing, and I think BDS springs from the readily accessible knowledge about the oppression of Palestinians by Israel. It's out of the bag. It's not like a big secret anymore, and we've been able to benefit by that. And aside from Palestinians and Jews, you know, the BDS movement has made huge headway with the Presbyterians, with the Methodists, you know, on a national scale, to the point where even the New York Times cannot hide. And particularly if you look at today's New York Times, there was a wonderful article about the occupation. And so, you know, I don't feel like we're on our back foot. Certainly if I were a Palestinian and felt I might be singled out here in the United States, it's a whole different ballgame. It's much more difficult. But typically what we try and do, and me personally, is go with Palestinians to events to show people that Palestinians, I was at a Unitarian church about a month ago or so with a Palestinian, and you know, I love getting up after he spoke and saying, isn't this something, you know, an American Jew, an ex-Zionist, and a Palestinian, I have no points of disagreement whatsoever. And for people to see that, that enables the organizing. That's what's pushing it from, because people understand that we should all be, you know, treated equally and not be underwriting this kind of oppression with our tax dollars. And just as human beings, we can't just sit and watch this. So I think that's what's pushing things forward, and I hope that answers your question.
No, definitely. I think that the key part of solidarity and the fact that each of you are working in your respective constituencies to build up and then towards sort of a common goal, I think is key. I want to encourage folks, if they have questions, to use the Q&A functions. We have about sort of 10 more minutes, and I want to make sure that we get to some concrete lessons learned, things that people can take away with them from this if they want to get involved and educate themselves. Anuja, you talked about the work that you did around the labor movement and examples of the in labor solidarity. So from your work, you know, what were some lessons learned, things that we can share in terms of organizing moving forward? And also, are there constituencies that need to be organized here around Palestinian justice, and who are they?
Sure, yeah. So I guess from my experience organizing the BDS vote at the UCs, I think a lot of our success really came from gaining support and really kind of building solidarity with a variety of groups, and specifically Students for Justice in Palestine. They were just like tremendously supportive and had advice and resources and always were present when we needed when we needed help, basically. And we did need a lot of help, because I think specifically, depending on what campus you were in, you were just facing a different set of challenges and different levels of backlash and so on. And so that was really helpful. Also, Jewish Voices for Peace, like the sort of university chapter of Jewish Voices for Peace, they were tremendously important. And getting like letters of endorsements from Jewish Voices for Peace was also important. And then, you know, kind of broadly, there were other sort of organizations, student organizations, that were important. So a lot of the organizing we did happened while Black Lives Matter was kind of emerging. So there was also this sort of like an analysis and a narrative that was emerging about Ferguson and about sort of police brutality and violence in the United States, and then connecting that with Palestine. And so there were sort of there was a kind of I guess a broad-based movement around state violence, and specifically state violence targeting people of color, but specifically also Palestinians, that we could sort of just kind of grasp. And so that was really important. And I guess sort of finally, you know, it really helped having high-profile voices. And in our case, it really helped having like professional academic organizations just kind of really back us up, and academics, you know, very, very high-profile academics speak at our events. So of course, you know, it's kind of like grassroots educating, and also really kind of inheriting much of the kind of work that had already been done, and kind of obviously, you know, paying tribute, but also kind of really getting advice and building on movements. That was sort of vital to not getting vilified and shut down so easily. And in terms of constituencies, I mean, I can definitely tell you that, like, you know, in terms of labor in the U.S., unions have not always shown support for the Palestinian struggle. So, and especially in comparison to their international counterparts, like COSATU in South Africa, for instance. So, I definitely think there's a lot of work to be done in the labor movement specifically, and it's a challenge, definitely. I think that in part because most senior leadership is very afraid of alienating political allies, and so, you know, within our own organizing, we had the Teamsters Union in California, you know, sort of write this letter saying that, you know, they wouldn't, you know, sort of support our bargaining efforts if we actually went through with this, and that kind of thing. So, you know, it's an incredibly treacherous kind of terrain. So I think that in terms of constituencies, definitely, like, supposedly a leftist progressive labor movement in the U.S. is not on board, and given that, you know, the U.S. is like a vital battleground, I think that that is a key place for organizing.
Great, thanks. Liz, I want to ask you, you talked about what activists are facing and the kind of issues that you're seeing, but are there ways in which folks who are beginning to organize their campaign think proactively about protecting themselves from some of these discrimination complaints? Are there ways in which they can think about their campaigns slightly differently that might protect them from the retaliation? Because that retaliation takes away from the key organizing work. And so maybe you could share about that, or anything else you want that we haven't talked about in terms of legal support and the legal community broadly?
Sure, that's a great question. I think one of as movement lawyers, we try to approach it as how can we use our response to the backlash to strengthen the movement itself. And you know, generally, I think how severe the backlash is actually a measure of how strong the organizing is. But I don't want to be you know, flippant about that, because that can tend to sort of underestimate the serious effects. And I think Lamis said it best about, you know, that Palestinians and Palestinian young people in the U.S. bear the brunt of the backlash. So it is very serious, but at the same time, it can be used to you know, to strengthen the campaigns itself. And to be specific, a good example of that is you know, when sort of opposition or Zionist opposition to BDS sort of goes too far in for their own, sort of can shoot themselves in the foot by going too far in attempting to censor and police. And that can be turned around into a campaign to actually promote, to promote boycott and divestment and promote the issues of the Palestinian struggle kind of in the mainstream and get it into the news. So, when a good example of that is at Northeastern last year when the students did a mock eviction action in the dorms distributing flyers to raise the issue of Palestinian home demolitions, and Northeastern University punished the students for basically for the content of their message in support of Palestinian rights and suspended the Students for Justice in Palestine chapter. In conjunction with sort of legal support, raising issues of free speech on campus and legal issues, there was an incredible community popular campaign led by the students to shame Northeastern for their for their total disregard of free speech values and for punishing students for their political activism. And that was interesting because it became a free speech campaign and everyone loves free speech, but more importantly, that got Palestine SJP and the issue of Palestinian home demolitions in the news. So that's, I don't know, that's just sort of an answer of sort of a way to hope and a way, I think, the most important strategy that every time we have a case, that's what we're thinking about as attorneys is, this is severe, how can we protect the interests of the individuals involved so that their lives are, so that they are protected, but how can we also use the backlash as a way to strengthen the movement itself?
Great. So we're going to slowly wrap up, and you talked a little bit, Liz, mentioned media strategy, so we're not going to have as much time to go deep into that, but I think proactive media strategy is always a very good way in terms of incorporating to organizing. I want to encourage folks who are listening now to ask any question. You can use the QA feature. Also, those of you who are tweeting with the hashtag #LawAtMargins, you can also tweet your questions there. So what I would like each of our guests to do, we're not going to cover the breadth and width of this discussion. So if folks have questions or afterwards, post that onto the event page on Facebook, and I'll be able to field those questions to our guests or get the information for you. But what I want to do is, since part of this is to get folks involved and educated, I'd like to ask each of our guests, starting with Lamis, how do folks get involved? If you can be specific, is an organization, if there's a campaign happening, how do folks get educated? And then just very briefly, just, if you have one sort of last sort of thought that maybe we haven't covered, burning thing that you want to say. So I just want to have the guests just take a minute each so that we can slowly wrap up this conversation. Thanks a lot. So starting with Lamis.
Thanks. So I'd like to refer people to two organizations who've done great work, one of them being the oldest Palestinian organization in the U.S., and the other being one of the most kind of inclusive, Al-Awda New York, www.alawdany.org, and U.S. Palestinian Community Network are great resources. People always ask, especially in the BDS movement, especially in the campus movement, is, well, what is this the proper thing to say? Am I framing this correctly? Is this a good idea for the movement? And we think that Palestinians should be part and parcel of those decisions, because these are decisions that affect their lives most directly. And so those are good places to kind of turn to. And there's a lot of good educational material and links for educational material there. Speaking again, and because everybody's touched so much and there are such diverse constituencies represented here, I'm going to focus on the Palestinian one. And part of what was brought up by a lot of the people here, Liz and Rick, is that in order to kind of, and Anuja also, was that, it helps to have non-Arab, non-Palestinian voices, because for so long Palestinians were vilified and had to take a step back. And what's happened in the BDS movement outside of campuses, and to some extent inside of campuses, is that Palestinians were not as involved in the BDS movement as non-Palestinians were, and I don't know if people know that. And so what we've been doing, especially in the past year, is going in New York. We're actually canvassing, where we're going door to door, speaking to Arabs, speaking to Palestinians who, you know, have literally been saying, well, where have you been? And why has it taken you so long to come here? So I'd encourage people to really go out into the communities, you know, and encourage people, make them feel safe, make the Palestinian and Arab communities feel safe in participating in this by having a physical presence in their communities. Another case I'd like to bring up, I'm sorry, Chaumtoli, is it's a very critical case. A great woman, Lamis J Deek's case, her sentencing is coming up. There's a lot to say about that case, but I think that it is the crystallization of the sort of backlash and attacks that the Palestinians suffer and face in the U.S. So we urge everybody to be aware of the Rasmiya Defense Committee, Samidun, which is a great political prisoner organization for Palestinians, is a great resource, and USPC, and her sentencing is March 12th. And I won't take up too much more of your time. Thank you again, Chaumtoli, and to all of you for all of your great work, really.
Great. I'll link these to the event page, and so folks can actually follow up there with those resources. Thanks a lot. Rick, how can people get involved specifically?
JVP.org would be the first place that I would refer people to, and even you know, people who are not Jewish, to see what alternative Jewish perspective looks like. You'll see a lot of resources there. I mentioned mondoweiss.com. It's a really good website. Electronic Intifada, another good website. And I would say for people who want to get to the hardcore data on human rights violations against the Palestinian people from an Israeli source, there's the Israeli Human Rights Organization, B'Tselem, which is B as in boy, apostrophe, T as in Tom, Z like zebra, ELEM.org. You see specifics and, you know, good data on what's really going on there. Beyond that, I would just say I think that there's an opening now to actually talking to low-level politicians. Even like there's a city council race here in California. Somebody came and knocked on my door, and I said, the one issue I'm going to tell you that you're off on, because I know you say you work for this other, this person came, the candidate came from another councilman's office, is that councilman, who's a friend of mine, you know, came out and blasted, you know, support for the Israeli government during the slaughter during this summer in Gaza. And I said, you know, I've had enough of that, and I want you as a candidate to tell me you're never going to do that. She called me on her cell phone to respond to somebody who was very excited about something, and I'm going to be able to call her back and talk to her. Now, she says that's not a local issue, and I'm going to say, well, it's been made a local issue by politicians in this city, and we're not going to just sit by and watch it anymore. And I'll tell you, we had a meeting once, I'll try and be brief with this, about 18 people met at the mayor's office impromptu. He didn't expect us. This is the past mayor, Villaraigosa, who came out of labor, as I came out of labor, and we impromptu ganged up on him in his office and demanded a meeting on the spot, and he finally came out about an hour later, and we sat and told him that his pronouncements supporting the government of Israel in this oppression were absolutely unacceptable. He never said another word for the rest of his term. So I would just say push anywhere you can push, and knowing that you've got the facts on your side.
Great. I'm going to ask the same question, Anuja and Liz. I just want to highlight one point. I mean, engaging local elected officials is really important. New York Council members are now on a tour of Israel that's funded. And I think there have been activists trying to ask them to not do that. And I think we started with Lamis saying, you can take a neutral position. You don't have to affirmatively take a position in support of Israeli actions in Palestine. You can just be neutral as well. And so I think here local elected officials can decide to do that. So again, briefly, would you want to wrap up, because we're a little bit over. Anuja, how can people get involved? Liz, how can people get involved?
Sure. I mean, I'll go first. So, in terms of, I guess just in terms of resources, Labor for Palestine is an excellent resource, and it just kind of chronicles different actions and initiatives that are being done to support BDS and the labor movement and around the world, and different statements and so on. So one of the things that you could do is actually get your union to be a part of this coalition of different labor unions who have supported BDS. So that's kind of important, signing on to the statement. And so you might want to like table a resolution or something at a meeting, at a union hall meeting, and try and garner support that way. The other thing is sort of in terms of the academic and cultural boycott, the Palestinian Campaign for an Academic and Cultural Boycott is also an important resource. There's also the U.S. version of that, U.S. ACB, that is really great if you are in academia. Then one of the things that you might want to do is also try and kind of galvanize support at either your graduate student union or your professional organization. So that's just kind of one thing. But yeah, like I think that the kind of bottom-up consensus building aspect is really important. I do, like you're saying, I mean, I think political channels are sort of opening, but it's still very important to kind of galvanize public opinion, and that sort of is the way to build pressure.
Liz?
Sure, I can be just very quick. For attorneys who are participating in this, if you'd like to get involved in providing legal support to activists who are facing backlash, two really important organizations is the National Lawyers Guild, Palestine Subcommittee. Lamis and I are both part of that, and then my organization, Palestine Solidarity Legal Support, is trying to organize attorneys in every region where there are activists, to plug them into offering support to those activists. So please get in touch with us. You can reach us through our website at PalestineLegalSupport.org.
Great. I want to thank each of you for this discussion. I think that it's been amazing. It's somewhat unfair to each of you to put it all into an hour, but I think that folks got an amazing resources, strategies, and some lessons learned. So thank you very much for participating, and look forward to the next Google Chat that will be on March 10th on International Women's Day on Women in the Global Workplace. So thank you all, and take care. Good night, good morning here in Bangladesh.
Good night, everybody. You all are great.
Good night, everybody.